Welcome to the Community Music Learning IJCM Conversation Series. My name is Alicia de Banfi-Hall, and today with Roger Mantai, I'm hosting this series. We're here today with Brydie-Leigh Bartleet, one of the associate editors of the International Journal of Community Music. Brydie is professor at the Queensland Conservatorium at Griffith University and Australian Research Council Future Fellow. Welcome, Brydie.
Thank you for having me. It's so nice to be here with you.
Brydie, how did you get involved in the field of community music?
Well, I think I've been involved in community music for as long as I can remember. As a child, I was a trumpet player and involved in all sorts of community groups when I started learning in Sydney, in Australia. And I'm originally from South Africa, and we went back to South Africa, and I found that that was a way in which I could make connections and make friends, and kept playing in many, many community groups. And then all through my studies, I was also heavily involved in playing in all sorts of ensembles and musical contexts, and then started conducting. And that was my foray into actually facilitating community music making for groups of community musicians. And in Australia, you know, we have lots of amateur, you might like to call them, bands and orchestras. And in Australia, that's called community music. And so that was sort of my foray into facilitating musical experiences for community members. But then I started to get really interested in community music making in other contexts. So in remote First Nations communities and migrant communities and other places around the country. And then started to really look at different ways of facilitating participatory music making in those sorts of contexts. But as a researcher, it was actually fresh out of my PhD that I had an amazing opportunity to be part of an Australian Research Council project that was 2 years and involved studying community music making right across the country, and met 400 community musicians and heard their stories from very remote First Nations communities to bustling urban centres. And I think we even found our way to some wine regions as well as other regional and rural contexts. And that was really where I got an opportunity to experience what it was like to be a researcher of community music as well as a maker and facilitator and player. So I've been involved in it for as long as I can remember.
Is that the 9 domains paper that you wrote in that first research project?
Yes, that was Soundlinks. And that was a project that was led by my colleague Halp Skippers, who's probably well known to many in our community music field. And it was really nice because it was part of what we call the linkage scheme. So we actually got to work with community partners who were in music education, but also our music council here. So they gave really interesting different lenses and perspectives on the topic of how community music works in Australia. So that's Soundlinks. And yes, that article you're talking about is the 9 domains of community music, which is what we observed from seeing the real diversity of practices across the country. It was such a fun project.
And very useful. I've used it in the German context.
I know. I love that.
So I think what's interesting is that you really have a perspective from Australia, from South Africa, but you also really understand the whole Asia-Pacific region. You've been very active in that region. So can you tell us a bit more about community music in your context, please?
Wow, it's diverse and it's rich, and it has a really long and different history from some of the stories we hear about how community music has developed maybe in the UK or other parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Now, when you say Asia-Pacific or Oceania, these are huge regions with enormous cultural diversity, very different political history, very different cultural customs, different stories of colonization, different stories of First Nations peoples and their histories. So there's this huge mix of cultural diversity. And as you would expect, community music practices here reflect that richness and that diversity. And I guess I had sort of had a sense of that, and having travelled quite a bit through Asia, and I got to do some amazing work in Thailand at a school there as well, very much in the community music facilitation space. I was going along to the ISME Community Music Activities Commission seminars, and I was hearing all of the stories and the insights that people were sharing and the histories and theories, and everybody seemed to have this common understanding, yes, we know what community music is, and we know what community music isn't. And I thought, well, this is great. This all makes sense in this context, but there are really different histories and trajectories and tensions and issues in the Asia-Pacific region, which are quite different from the UK-centric story we so commonly hear. So it was actually at the ISME conference in China all the way back in 2010 that a few of us got together and we said, wouldn't it be interesting if we had a more regional gathering for community musicians in the Asia-Pacific to see what sorts of conversations are bubbling here and how they're different from what's happening in the UK. And so that's happened, and we've been in Brisbane, and we've been in Japan, and we've been in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we've been to Hong Kong, and then last year we were in Malaysia. And it's really interesting to hear how people are defining community music in these regions, not being bound by these UK-centric ideas of intervention of a facilitator, but much more organic, culturally derived community music practices. And there are also a lot of ethics around the ongoing legacies of colonization in many of these countries. It's not over, it's not finished, it's still rife. And there are politics around how we make music with communities that get very much embedded in these complex colonial and often oppressive sorts of structures and ways of working. And so I guess in this region, there's a lot of concern and thought around cultural politics and cultural integrity and the ethics of how we work as community musicians, which I do think have resonances right across the world. This is not just this region, but they're really acute here. And we also have just such strong First Nations cultural practices. As I mentioned, we'd been in Aotearoa, New Zealand as well, where we had an amazing gathering that had such strong Māori traditions and insights that were woven in along with the Pacific as well. And that really coloured how we sort of thought about and dialogued about community music as a field, and I think reflect these really interesting practices that we see happening in this region. So it's certainly not a homogenous whole. What's happening in Australia is very different from what's happening in Japan and China, but that cultural contextual specificity is really what makes it interesting.
What do you think you called it the sort of UK-centric definition of community music, or the Northern Hemisphere sort of common understanding maybe. What do you think that area of the world can learn from all this activity and that you've just described? Sort of being in one field, but having such different maybe origins, but also themes that people think about and that are important.
It's a great question. And I have been cheeky because I'm just using big, broad brushstrokes when I say UK-centric. And then when I say that, my UK colleagues quickly get onto my back and say that we don't all think the same way. Be careful about how you describe it. And of course, I'm not trying to say that the whole Northern Hemisphere is all singing from the same songbook. That's not the case at all. I'm just pointing towards some of the dominant discourses and traditions in our field when I say that. In terms of what other parts of the world can learn from what's happening here, I think there's a lot to learn from the really strong First Nations cultures we have. In my part of the world, here in Australia, we have the longest living culture in the world. 60,000 years plus of ongoing culture that has been passed on from generation to generation through song, through dance, through painting, through how all of those come together to connect people to the country that they're on and to the spiritual world and to their sense of self. And in these contexts, I have been so challenged in the best possible way to think about what does community mean and what does it mean to come together to make music and make space for everybody to feel like they have a role and they are valued and they are welcomed in a hospitable space. There's so much to learn from how these First Nations cultures work and operate and think about everything in such interconnected ways. in the Australian First Nations context, for many cultures, because there's multiple First Nations cultures here in Australia, there isn't a word for music because music is not a singular entity. Music doesn't exist on its own like we think about in a Western context. Music is completely interconnected to the trees, to nature, to all of the animals that are part of your living place, to your ancestors, to the songs that you sing as a map to guide you around the country. And I think that interconnected way of thinking on a heartfelt level, on an intellectual level, on a theoretical level, on a practical level is really, really exciting for us as a field. And we have a lot to learn from. And I'm not saying that we then go and pinch ideas and appropriate them inappropriately, which community music's got a great tradition of. Let's just sing this little song from Africa and it's lovely, but we don't know where it came from. So I'm not saying that. I'm saying making space for these cultural bearers to share and for us to witness and to really make space for. I think that there's a lot that can be learned from all of the First Nations cultures in this context that make us think about facilitation in different ways, because these are collective cultures often that don't single out an individual, but it doesn't mean that sophisticated ways of facilitation are not operating and are not happening. So I think there's a lot to learn there, as well as just really rich cultural traditions of making music and making instruments and how song carries so much knowledge and information, more than just a little ditty that we might sing, that we can learn a lot from. So I think it really can challenge us as a field to think more deeply about what the community in community means and what happens when those come together. So those are just a few little examples of things that come to mind that I have learned a lot as a non-Indigenous migrant to this country, and really benefited from just making space and sitting down and spending time with a lot of cultural bearers and elders over the years.
So I'm going to switch now to the journal. We've heard about the evolution of the journal from other editors. How do you think we can make space for diverse voices to join the conversation and remain engaged with the field?
It's a great question, because I think the journal plays a really key role in our field. We only have one journal of community music in the world, and so it's a really important place and platform for us sharing ideas and also being able to have conversations across the world in terms of sharing our insights and practices. But I think there's a danger when we're working within fairly conventional publishing and academic rigid guidelines, that it can end up just being a small minority of voices who end up talking to one another again and again with fairly similar conversations, but they just bring a different project, but similar lenses too, and have the same conversations again and again. So I think as a journal, we're challenged to really think about how we make space for some of these different ideas and different perspectives to find a home. And that also means maybe broadening our conceptualization of what we think community music is. As I said, I remember those early conversations I sat in, 15, 20 years ago, when everyone would nod at the back of the room, oh yes, this is community music, or oh no, that's not community music. And I think that there's a really robust conversation we can have that really extends what those definitional boundaries might be, because often things will be included or not included on the basis of whether they fit within those bounds of what community music is. And I think, there's a lot of really creative, interesting publishing happening around the world that has nice supplementary, very multimedia-based ways of thinking about how we might do a submission beyond simply just words of 6,000 to 7,000, and fairly stock standard structures and things. So I think there's quite a few structural things we need to think about. I think there are definitional things we need to think about, and also how we make space as a broader field to welcome in voices, not just as little bits of, nice spice, a little bit of something different but don't change anything else, but how we actually open up space so that those voices can actually be central to how we think about ourselves as a field and moving forward. So I think the journal can play a really key role, but it's always a balancing act, because when you're a journal and you're working with a publisher, there's all sorts of rules and conventions that we have to follow. So it's quite a balancing act. And I think the editorial board, which represents really nice, diverse perspectives and cultural contexts and people with different experience, are really great for that, because these are the sorts of discussions we've been having of late.
And you're not just an editor of the journal, you've also been one of the authors who've contributed the most to the journal, with a range of articles and also a number of editorials. One of them was the 9 Domains, I think, was also published in the journal that we talked about in the beginning, and others. Why did you choose to publish these in the International Journal of Community Music?
Well, most of the things I published in there were before I was an editor. So I've obviously thought really carefully about when I do publish in the journal. And, other community music scholars will all probably relate to this. It's really hard to know where to submit our work, right? You can submit a journal article to the International Journal of Community Music, but, then what? You can't just keep publishing in that place and that place only. We need to think about where we can pitch our work to other audiences, where it's going to be well received and understood, but where we can maybe make contributions to other fields. So it's something I think about a lot. And I'm more recently been publishing in journals, for example, that focus on social justice or community development, as well as music education, more recently ones in health and well-being as well, thinking about how we can make contributions more broadly. But the ones in our field I've deliberately published because I want to speak to our field. I want to have a conversation with our field. And the most recent one I published was around a framework for thinking about social impact in community music, because I really felt there's a need in our field to have a robust conversation about projects, and there's a lot of them, that seek to have social justice or social impact outcomes. And I think we're very flimsy and loose in how we actually describe how we get to those outcomes. We just say we want to do them, and then we presume magic happens and everybody will trust us that they did happen, and all social ills were cured by community music. I think we can do better. And so that article was just the start of a conversation. Of course, I'm already revising that framework and thinking about even more dimensions to it. But it was trying to sort of say, how do we think about moving beyond just those individual outcomes which we so commonly report in really tiny, small-scale little projects and, research programs. How do we think about them at a much more macro scale, and how do we think about social change and how that happens through community music? And we need a bit of a framework that takes a social ecological approach from that individual right up to the meso community level up to the macro. So that was deliberately trying to start a conversation with our field. And it's been really interesting because lots of people from the field have written, but so too have people from community sports, from health and well-being, and all these other fields that are saying we've got the same problems. And it's been interesting to see how you articulate them. I also did a piece on love, and that was part of a special issue that was focusing on community music and peace and conciliation. And I was trying to propose that love might be a framework for thinking about that. There was another one that reflected on the community music activities seminar that we had in China, because I thought that was a really fascinating moment for our field, where I saw those tensions I was talking about before, of when we transplanted what had been a reasonably comfortable conversation in some of the European contexts into that Chinese context, and to see the beautiful tensions and understandings and common points, but huge misunderstandings as well around how this sort of field and discussion fits within that context. So that was a reflection on that. And then you mentioned, I think, probably the Sound Links work as well. So in each of those cases, it's been because I've wanted a conversation with the field, whether it's around social impact or it's around how our field fits within that Chinese context. So those were the reasons for why I did those.
Yeah, and you have such a range of what you research, which is another really interesting, I think, about you as a researcher. You've just mentioned that paper on love, which I would like you to talk a little bit more about. Can you talk about how you've worked with the concept of love in your writing?
So I was interested in how the concept of love could be useful for us thinking both in theoretical and practical terms, particularly in my context that I was reflecting on when it comes to intercultural music making in community contexts. So I used it as a chance to reflect on many, many years of collaborative community music making with First Nations communities, which if you've read my work, you'll see there's lots of stories about that. And love is a really interesting concept to work with. And when I talk about love, I'm talking about compassionate love. And it seems to be a taboo topic. Very few people have talked about love, and I think there's this fear that it might be misinterpreted, or we're talking about erotic love. Dear God, erotic love and community music. Can you just imagine the outroar or the shenanigans and fun? We're talking here about compassionate love, and I've been really influenced by the work of the late Bell Hooks in this regard, in terms of thinking about love as a participatory action, a verb, something that we do. And it's a participatory action that we can take, but it's also a mode of liberation. And it's all those qualities that we think about in terms of love, in terms of respect and understanding one another. And it becomes a really useful frame for thinking about how we undergo practice, but also how we think about liberation in contexts where there's been enormous oppression, and how love can also be very micro in its little interactions, and how those micro acts of kindness can sometimes light a path forward in contexts where it is just so complex and so dark we don't know what to do. And so I, in that article, play with examples of the ways in which love can provide that kind of that light, or that the candle spark that can guide us through that complexity. But I also talk about how love can also be challenging, in that I talk about the idea of loving too hard too fast and going too hard and falling head over heels, which can sometimes be problematic in community music settings where we're all gushing and thinking this is great, and we're working in particular in contexts where there might not have been a lot of love, or there might be a lot of trauma, and we need to be careful about that. I also talk about how love can sometimes make us blind. And I use some examples of growing up in South Africa and realizing as an adult, looking back on all the love and affection I felt, for example, our domestic maid. And I now realize how my love made me completely blind to the incredibly complex and dark cultural politics and oppression and everything else that was going on. And I think that can happen in many other contexts where we're feeling so good and loved up on the community music making practices that we're engaging in. And I'm thinking about some more recent work we've done in prisons or post-conflict war zones. You can then become a little bit blind sometimes to some of those dynamics because of that love that we're showing. And so I just found it was a really interesting concept to play with in terms of thinking about community music, particularly in these intercultural contexts. And there's some amazing theoretical work around love that I think many community musicians would resonate with.
That leads really nicely to another question I have, because one of the things you do, which I really enjoy when I read your work, is that you really interweave very personal perspectives or experiences like the one you just mentioned in your writing within this sort of more academic format. And you use a wide range of different methodologies in your research, from large-scale studies to auto-ethnographic work. What guides your choices in writing style and methods you use?
I think it always needs to be driven by the question that is itching that you need to answer in a particular project. It needs to be guided by the context in which you're working, where certain things are appropriate and certain things aren't. It needs to be guided by how you're trying to communicate the ideas and what the most appropriate means for doing that is. There's nothing worse than when someone gets fixated on a particular methodology or way of writing, and then they replicate it again and again and again and again, no matter what the context, no matter what the question, no matter who the audience is. It's just all they know how to do, and they replicate it. I've done the opposite. I've always been driven by what is needed now and what is the best way to understand what's going on in this particular context. And I think sometimes those insights can come from the tiny microscopic individual level. I think there's enormous insights that can come from the lived experience of an individual when it's a life well examined and put into a broader context, which is what autoethnography does. It's not autobiography, it's autoethnography, so it's always being put in context. But I think there's equally interesting insights that can come when we take a really collective view. We fly over the top of it, or we take a regional view and we look at, what sorts of stories emerge when we bring together all this archipelago of, projects and insights and what can we learn from that. And so all of those require different approaches to doing research and different then modes of writing. But I don't shy away from the personal, because I think the personal is political and the political is personal, and there's a lot that can be revealed. And you also then can speak with a degree of, dare I say, authenticity or a degree of lived experience when you're telling your own story and you're writing from what you know. And people connect with that. People see that you are sharing your story, you are making yourself vulnerable. And they respond with an equal degree of vulnerability, but reflexivity as well. And so that's, I guess, why I've always been drawn to the autoethnographic sphere as well as the big, large-scale, huge, complex studies like the big one I'm doing right now. I think they all have a place in our field. It's all about storytelling at the end of the day. They're big stories and they're little stories. And sometimes the little stories are the biggest stories.
I think it does make your work really, it makes people connect, or at least that's what it did with me. I agree, but it's still quite unusual, isn't it? It's not sort of the norm, if you can say that.
It's hard to do, isn't it? People think, oh, you're just writing your own story. It's easy because you're just writing your own experience. And I had one very ignorant ethics advisor once say to me, oh, well, you're doing autoethnography. That means you don't need to apply for ethics at the university. And I was like, no, actually, this is the most complex ethics ever, because you're talking about people close to you and there's complex relationships that need to be managed. It's really hard. So it's interesting. I mean, I think more people are doing autoethnographic studies. I've seen more of these emerging across all different fields. I just spoke at an autoethnographic conference recently, and it was really interesting to see the wide range of contexts where it's being used. But it's hard. It's hard work because you need to put the microscope on yourself, and it's very hard to then turn off any kind of, you can't put barriers very easily between you and your work, and you have to really be ready to do that hard work. It's tricky.
If we go zoom out again at the field, what do you see as current challenges and future opportunities for the field of community music, but also the role the journal can play in advancing these?
Wow, well, there's lots of challenges, and I sort of think of challenges as opportunities, so they're two sides of the same coin. I think in terms of the journal, there's a really important role for research to play. If we want to progress as a field in terms of our practice and the way that we operate in the world and the kind of, dare I say, impact that we can have with the work that we do in the reach, it needs to be grounded in really rigorous reflection and research and sharing across our field. So I think that that's a really key challenge for us in terms of extending ourselves and not just replicating the same old. And also that challenge we were talking about earlier about making it a more inclusive space for diverse voices from across the world and different regions to really tap into to what we're saying. I think a perennial issue the world over is training, and you're doing amazing work there in Germany and leading the charge with the training that you're doing. And I know that you're also then connecting to Ireland and Kathleen's work there and Kathleen Turner's work and with her cohort of students. And then we're doing incredible work in Canada as well. And so over the last 10 years, there's been a rapid development and I think beautiful sophistication in how those courses are being run in ways that are sensitive to the practice and its ethos, but also working within higher education contexts. But in Australia, we still don't have those sorts of training programs on offer. And so it's very ad hoc and a bit opportunistic where some organisations might offer some professional development, but there isn't the same kind of, higher education experience, or they're really bedded or buried within other programs and they don't have the time and space that they possibly need. So I think training is another one, as well as research. It'd be remiss for me not to say funding. In talking to so many community musicians, it's just an ongoing, and it kind of feels like a broken record to say it. But it does affect the daily realities, and it does affect how people operate. And it's not just how small the funding pools are, but that they're so short-term. So there's just this hamster wheel where you've barely finished a project and you're having to think about the next pot of funding. And that short-term cycle is not good for the field's development nor long-term building of relations with communities. In our context, and I don't know if it's the same in your German context, I see opportunities but also challenges in terms of how we fit within a broader policy landscape. So community music is so specifically localized, which is its great power, but what that means is it's often absent from these more national debates. So we've just got a new cultural policy, and community music's kind of in there but kind of not. It just doesn't figure. There's a big movement around social prescribing. I've been asked to do a keynote for a conference for that in June, and there's a lot for us to work out as a field to position ourselves as players in that social prescribing pace, where there's all sorts of development of new social policies. And so there's a challenge for us there in that we're so localized. We're not joining the dots together at national and international levels to really advocate for something bigger than our local communities. But we don't want to get rid of that localized specificity either. So that's kind of like a tension that we face. And the other area where I see a lot of potential, and this relates to my current project, is around cross-sector work. So how, as community musicians, are we working with the health sector, with criminal justice sector or corrections? How are we working with education? In my field of equity, there are really big, what they call collective impact initiatives, which are bringing together all these different sectors to come around the table and to say we're going to try and tackle disadvantage in this particular area and focus on 0 to 8 years old and have all these things happen. And it just never ceases to amaze me how absent music is in those conversations. And so I think there are challenges there for how we become part of those conversations without losing that intrinsic, beautiful, organic community music mode where people go along not because it's good for their, social connection and inclusion and social capital. They go there because it just feels good. So there are all these tensions between how we operate as a practice, but also these possibilities where we could be tapping into making contributions towards national policy and international policy and all of these cross-sector efforts which are trying to work towards big ticket items of eliminating poverty or dealing with climate change, where we need to be present, but how do we make space for our voices there and hold on to the local practice that is basically what really makes us work as well as we do. So I see all of those things playing out. That's what I'm interested in researching and writing about and talking with international colleagues on. So in other words, it's a good space to be in. For a long time, I think community musicians are going to be needed in the world, and we've got a challenge to up our game.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a beautiful final word, Brydie. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for listening to the Community Music Learning IJCM Conversation Series.
Thanks for having me.